In polite conversation with people, there is this one question that you just never ask people. Which is your favorite child? Honestly, that's not even just a polite conversation thing. I mean, that's just, you just don't ask people that. Like you shouldn't ask somebody, like, who's your favorite kid? On the other side of that spectrum, you should never ask somebody who their least favorite kid is. But as an author, inevitably somebody will ask you, what's your favorite book? And then after maybe you explain to them, I love this one for this reason, this reason, this reason, you might get the question, which is your least favorite book? And of all the books that I've written, if I'm being completely and totally honest, I do have a least favorite. It's not this one, by the way. My least favorite is probably the first book I ever wrote. The first book I ever wrote was an education book, but of the novels that I've written, the one that I have the most trouble with, as far as enjoying it myself, like liking it, if I have to be honest, it's Red Hand Rising, which is the second book in the Sawyer Shepherd Chronicles. But I want to talk to you about why that is. It's not because I feel like it's the worst I wrote of the novels. I think I have some other errors maybe that pop up in earlier books that I've written, but it's my least favorite for a reason that I think a lot of people don't like certain movies in a series, that things have to happen in a book that puts you in a strange position of this has to happen in order for what I know I'm building to later, but I really just don't like it. Today we're going to talk about that on the Didactic Cafe. I'm your host, Chad Lehrmann. Pretty soon after I finished the first book in the Sawyer Shepherd Chronicles, Rites of Passage, I dove right into Red Hand Rising. And my reasoning behind it was pretty simple. It was fresh. I wanted to continue that story, even though there's a time skip in this particular book. There's about a year gap. I had written a few short stories that continued the Sawyer Shepherd Chronicles between Rites of Passage and Red Hand Rising, and those are available on my website if you want to dig around and find them. And really what I wanted to do is I really wanted to get that book out. And if I'm being completely candid and honest, I was at that point reading a lot of stuff about authors talking about how in order for you to make a living off of reading, off of writing, you really have to have a lot of books out. And at that point I had two. I had my teacher book, which was, again, my first attempt at writing. And I still think it's a good book. I just don't think it's my best by any means. The Classroom They Remember. So I had that book, which was selling promptly like nothing, like maybe even negative numbers. I don't know how that's possible, but I feel like that was kind of a thing. And then like Rites of Passage was great, but I got a lot of sales off of the first book, and I had like 500 plus free downloads at one point because I did a free thing. Again, not something I would do looking back. Probably like 99 cents, get it out there, that kind of thing. But I got 500 books of them out there. So a lot of books were out there, but I had nothing for people to go to. And that was my mistake. So looking at Red Hand Rising, it was definitely a book that was written to establish this is a series and it's going to be going on again. And there's more stuff. But I also really wanted to take and do a story that was tonally the opposite of Rites of Passage. Rites of Passage was this claustrophobic, stuck in a small town, relatively limited number of characters and interactions, and that was great, and I loved that, and there was an intensity to that. But with Red Hand Rising, I wanted to open up the world, literally. I wanted to create a scenario which would be a world-building opportunity, if you will. So what I did was I took Sawyer out of Sage City, and I put him on the road. And I found out fairly quickly in writing the book that this is not who he is. The mistake was not putting him on the road. The mistake was putting Sawyer Shepherd in a big city. And St. Louis was for a number of reasons. I chose the city. One, I wanted kind of a Midwest component. I had family who lived in St. Louis growing up. And and honestly, I had in mind this great scene, which is in the book actually, involving the City Museum in St. Louis. Which, if you haven't been there, it's a really cool place. It's like reclaimed airplane parts and metal and hubcaps and all sorts of crazy stuff. And it's basically a giant art display that you can actually play on. It's like a theme park made out of junk that's been reclaimed and refurbished. It's an awesome place, and you can kind of get a little bit of that when you read the scene that's in the book. And so I really wanted to use that. I thought that was a really cool way to do it. And I also had like several pictures on my camera roll from St. Louis that I could use for promotional purposes. So that kind of played a part in it too. But with that being said, I wanted St. Louis because it's not your typical big city that gets used in movies. You always see Chicago's and New York's and LA's and those kind of places, and even to an extent Dallas and Houston, but not so much St. Louis. So I threw St. Louis in there, and it was a fun way to kind of go in and find those things, like going back to my childhood, going there to visit my grandparents when they lived in St. Louis, and just remembering some of the things from that. And it was good. It was good. But what I found was the bigness of the city, in a sense, led to a dwarfing of Sawyer. And I can't really put that into words. And I think that's why I struggle with this book some, is that he's truly a fish out of water. Like, he doesn't fit in that situation, but it had to happen. I had to put Sawyer in the big city in order to open up the world, if that were. So for those of you who have read Red Hand Rising, basically what you have is a scenario where there is a serial killer loose in St. Louis, and that serial killer is pretty supernatural. Like, people think he's supernatural. There's some elements to it that in the crimes and the crime scenes where you're kind of led to believe that he's supernatural, but there's also some definite information being given in the book that he is killing other supernatural entities that we have not yet seen in Sawyer Shepherd's world. And that was going to be another big key component, was I wanted to introduce my own version of an angel, if you would, for the second book. So the first book's heavily influenced, Rites of Passage is heavily influenced by Supernatural, the TV show. And one of my favorite entrance points in the show was when, in season 5, they introduced the angels, specifically Castiel. And I love that concept. I love that idea of having a benevolent, but at the same time, kind of nebulous, if you will, like mysterious figure. Like, is he really on our side? Is he really not on our side, kind of thing. And so I wanted to introduce that. But in order to do that, I had to have bigger stakes, that these things wouldn't just show up for any old random serial killer. So I also used Red Hand Rising to introduce a couple of long recurring characters, one in particular. One of those characters that I introduced was Landon Conley. And Landon Conley is this outsider, this FBI agent who is investigating the serial crimes that are there. And he witnesses something that lets him know he needs to call in someone who knows this stuff. And in this particular story, Conley's, at that point, deceased partner had worked with our mentor figure, who had worked with Eli Romer. And Eli, and he basically calls Eli up, and Eli shows up with Sawyer and Mandy. So I introduced Landon because I wanted to have this figure who is initially like, these guys are stupid, crazy, and I don't want anything to do with them. But I also wanted to have Landon in there as this character who unlike Sawyer, he becomes a part of the world, not because it's his destiny, but because it kind of falls in his lap. And so I made some character choices with him too. I wanted to create a little bit more tension between Sawyer and Mandy, because, you know, that whole will they, won't they thing that was left at the end of Rites of Passage. And I wanted to create a character that would potentially sway Mandy's interest. And again, I don't want to go into great detail on a lot of the story, because I am going to spoil one of the big things of the book in today's reading. But I just know that I created Landon for a purpose, and then I needed a good way to get out of that. And so I like Landon. And in fact, Landon has been a very interesting character to flesh out. I'm finishing up the editing and getting ready to put book 4 out. And Landon's still with us in book 3 and 4. And so oops, spoiler. I really look forward to seeing where his character arc takes people, and see what people think of like where I take him in that. But getting to the heart of it, I introduced the Zeitgeist, this angelic figure, this angelic creature, or creatures, who basically represent the best ideals of Americana. And I chose what I chose, like independence being the primary one, or indie being the primary Zeitgeist, because I feel very strongly that perhaps independence, go at it your own way, is sort of the quintessential American value. And I feel like I wanted to create this rustic old cowboy image for him, and that's what I really did. And then we slowly begin to introduce his quote unquote siblings as the book goes on. And so independence represents this rough and tough, independent, I'm going to do it my own way, I'll be there if I feel like it kind of guy. And then we introduce Faith, and Faith is the opposite of that. Faith is mysterious, but at the same time wants to help. And so those were being the two main ones, and then we throw science in there too, to kind of balance out that trinity of them. Their other siblings also appear, and what I found I enjoyed about writing the Zeitgeist was, because they were not an established lore figure, I kind of got to play with what they were. And so I like the idea that they have this appearance that they show up with to Sawyer that's very human. And then you'll find that they have other appearances as well that shows up. And it also gave me away, because I knew what I was building. I wanted to give Sawyer some powers. Not like exuberant powers or anything like that, but I wanted to have something that kind of, I guess if you're looking at it from a hero's journey perspective, I wanted to have something where he has gone into a place and he's brought back a special weapon. And that's really kind of what this book is. So book 2, Red Hand Rising, is really about kind of building that up. There are Zeitgeists. You've got some new characters, Landon Conley, another one that pops up as a potential love interest for Eli. You know, Eli, grumpy old man, Eli. But I really wanted to give him a potential partner in the form of Natalie, who appears in this book. So, with that being said, I want to get to the heart of, while this may not be my favorite novel that I've written, it has probably one of my most favorite scenes I've written. I absolutely love the scene that I'm going to read to you now, simply because it was, as I'm writing it, it was the first time that I really felt a tension. Like I wanted to write faster because like I knew where it was going, but I wanted to get there. I wanted to find that place. And every time I would want to get closer to it, I would want to create something that put a barrier to it. And just these subtle little movements. It's tense without having any physical action, save for the very end. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in here. And by the way, I am going to tell you, this is one of the spoilers for the book. I feel like now that book 3 has been out for a while and book 4 is on its way, this is a significant spoiler if you have read Rites of Passage, but if you've not read Red Hand Rising, I would stop here, get Red Hand Rising, come back, and then you'll see. But right here, Red Hand Rising, this particular scene, I'm jumping in here in the middle of the book, actually. Looks like, I can't remember what chapters exactly it was. Chapter 13, ooh, unlucky chapter. And in chapter 13, Sawyer Shepherd's going for coffee. He had a destiny, or rather a destiny had him. And no matter how much he wanted to shirk it to take a less resistant path, he could not. His faith was tied to a bigger story than his own that he could fathom, even at that moment. It was this thought running through his head when he stepped into the warmth of the coffee shop. It was a mixture of industrial beams and exposed brick combined with some lightly stained wood here and there. The smell of coffee and baked goods was overwhelmingly welcome. It was empty, save for the lone barista at the bar. She was as one would expect in a modern coffee shop. Her hair was pulled under a cap, and the edges that stuck out were a magenta and black mixture. She wore large horn-rimmed glasses, and sported at least 4 rings in her ear cartilage. Tattoos were visible on her arms as she leaned wearily over the bar, resting her chin in her hands. She barely noticed him as he walked up, but as he stepped to the counter, she perked up. She smiled pleasantly, and Sawyer noted the lip ring that had been hidden by her profile, when he walked in. "Morning," she said with a lazy attempt to hide a yawn. "Morning," he smiled back. "Early morning or late night?" He attempted to establish small talk while I perused the menu that was printed to look like it was a chalkboard just over the bar. "A little of both, I guess," she said kindly. "I think I'll take the caramel mocha, biggest size you've got." "You got it. I'll bring it to you." He made his way to a small table near the back of the shop and sat down. He pulled out the phone to check the morning headlines. Nothing about any further murders. It had been 3 days since they met Faith. Indy showed up, and Conley had the last death to deal with. They had seen Conley on several occasions, and he had begun to process the revelation of the supernatural world much more effectively. Mandy was accommodating, being the compassionate one. And Sawyer could not help but feel a pang of jealousy when he saw them together. Eli was right. Mandy was a special lady, and if he didn't act soon, someone would. But should he? Really? It was a dangerous thing to be someone Sawyer cared about. His parents were killed in a church shooting, and he had begun to think that it might not have been a random choice that led to that. Sawyer had started to have memories resurface over the last year, memories of a town with dark secrets that never made sense until he discovered the truth. A strange man named Bill that weaved in and out of his life. Most significantly, the night he and a friend had fallen into an old well. Then that friend died not long after that. As had numerous young people over the years in that town, and the knowledge that his parents had been judges, like he now was, and kept it from him, made him wonder if normal life was even possible. Deep down, Sawyer knew that someday he would have to return to McClellan. He would have to face the past, one that might hold a treasure trove of information about his present and even his future. Or it may hold nothing at all. While thinking that, the barista brought over his coffee. He thanked the girl and went to take a sip from the piping hot and intensely pleasant scented beverage. Almost instantly, he heard a familiar voice come from the hallway that stood behind where Sawyer was seated. "Why, Sawyer Shepherd, what are the odds?" The last time he had really heard that voice, Sawyer had assumed it was coming from a demon rather than possessing a businessman. That voice had been slightly different from the man's normal voice, but it was the deep, resonating, and at the same time, grating demonic voice he heard now. And then he knew. It was the voice of Lennox Dupree, and it was a demon's voice. And Dupree was that demon, not an innocent person controlled by an evil entity. Dupree walked up from behind Sawyer, who was frozen stock still. Dupree patted him on the back, then walked around and sat across from him. As usual, Dupree wore a very fancy black suit with a deep red tie over a pinstripe dress shirt. His blonde hair was slicked back and perfectly in place. Not a hair stood where it should not. His deep green eyes were intense and piercing right into Sawyer's. He was a devastatingly handsome man with a strong jaw and a sharp, defined cheekbones. He smiled, and each tooth was perfect, dazzling, and white. "It has been a year, has it not, since we last met?" Dupree paused for a moment to let Sawyer respond. When he did not, Dupree continued. "It's clicking into place for you, isn't it? Why the demon got out when it did. Why so many things fell just so." He accented each word with the index finger jab to the tabletop. "And why you were in St. Louis, investigating a strange series of murders just as Lucius Furr is about to acquire a major piece of real estate." He paused and raised his hand to the barista, who immediately began preparing a coffee. "It seems a bit familiar." Sawyer was terrified. Dupree was Lucius Furr's number 2 business guy. He, along with Furr, were the current prime suspects to be Lucifer in their investigation. But he found his voice. "It seems a little too familiar for me." "How has your year been?" he said as coolly as possible. He wanted to read what Dupree was playing at. "Lucrative, but I don't really care about that. It has also been one for new ventures. This building here in St. Louis, for one." The barista brought a steaming mug to Dupree. "And more team members like Mavis here." Mavis, the barista, smiled her pleasant smile, then her eyes flashed a yellow color. She turned and walked away. Dupree must have seen Sawyer's quick jump. "Oh, I think we're past the pretense here. That business that Furr and I do is exclusively of the natural and economic sort. I think you and that old man figured that out not long after our first encounter. But the question I think you're asking yourself right now is, just how supernatural are Lucifer and Linux Dupree? Sawyer became aware that his left leg had begun to bounce nervously up and down. It reached a fever pitch in that moment of silence. He licked his lips and took a deep breath. One of you is the devil himself. Level of the supernatural. Dupree's lips split into a broad, almost cartoonish grin. He tossed his head back and began to laugh. No one but Mavis and Sawyer would see it, though, being the only patrons at this early hour. The laugh carried on for a decent amount of time. When Dupree finally calmed himself, he wiped a single tear of joy from his eye with a deft finger. Yes, that assumption is correct. But have you figured it out yet? Which one of us is the boss? Sawyer's leg was moving at light speed now. He had no weapon, definitely not the gladius. And he had a 50-50 chance that he was chatting with Lucifer himself. Bad day to forget the rules, Eli taught him. Coming alone, no weapon. He assumed his best bet was to play it coy. Go back and forth. It dawned on him, why was Dupree toying with him? It seemed like he was desperate to let the secret out, but why? How could that serve their plan? Dupree smiled again. He took a sip of his coffee and leaned forward. His elbows rested on the table and his head cocked slightly to the left. He fixed his eyes on Sawyer. What do you think you know about Lucifer? Oh, good. Dupree wanted to play Bible trivia. Good thing Sawyer had been brushing up over the last year. Archangel, got jealous, fell from heaven, turned into a snake, tricked a woman, pretty much been trying to screw things up for mankind since then. Dupree smirked and nodded. Right. So since Lucifer was all hands-on with the snake incident, he learned a lesson. Direct involvement as a last resort. He showed up to test Job, of course, and of course with Jesus of Nazareth, for a couple of temptation sessions. But Lucifer learned his real shot was in playing puppet master. For no apparent reason, Sawyer felt his bravado returning. Is this where you start telling me that Satan was pulling Hitler's strings? Dupree's smile vanished. That moron squandered his shot on a petty revenge plot for some perceived slight he felt an entire population had given him. He could have ruled the world. Instead, he nearly destroyed anything that would have been worth ruling. Now Sawyer smirked. That was not a denial. Dupree narrowed his eyes at Sawyer. Fine. Yes, Lucifer was pulling his wires. But not how you think. Hitler was not possessed. Not how you think, anyway. Dupree pushed back at the table. You met a few of the zeitgeists, I assume. The what now? Dupree shook his head. I forgot. You never went to college. Or not much, anyway. The woman on top of the church, the old cowboy from up north. They are zeitgeists. Really the personification of them. A zeitgeist is a cultural mood or value, and you don't have to Google it. Zeitgeist? Sawyer let that roll around in his head for a bit. Let me guess. Hitler was possessed of a German zeitgeist when he launched World War II. I'm guessing some form of pride? Dupree smiled again. Very close. Nationalism. When a human becomes a champion of a zeitgeist, it amplifies the human while allowing the zeitgeist to take on a more active role. Most of these zeitgeists prefer to avoid this entanglement, but sometimes it must be done. Suddenly it clicked. The killer. The Red Hand. He killed respect to lure them here. You're planning to force one of the zeitgeists into possessing someone. Don't think so limited. Several people? Or several zeitgeists? Dupree sipped his coffee and smiled again. You never really answered who you think Lucifer is, Sawyer's mind was racing. Why was Dupree telling him this? Wasn't this classically the villain's mistake? Telling the hero the plan, unless... You need me for something, don't you? Dupree's smile slipped. Don't be ridiculous. Yeah, that makes sense. You think I'm one of the champions of a zeitgeist, one you need for a plan. That's why you haven't killed me yet. I'm part of your plan. Dupree's face turned sour. You're still alive because I cannot kill you. Yet. Sawyer's mind flashed to something. Bible trivia. Job. God let Satan take everything from Job, but was not allowed to take his life. Sawyer had lost his parents, his home, in a sense. He had a fear that he would eventually lose all he had now acquired in his fresh start. The dream where the bearded guy kept telling him to endure. It's you. You're Lucifer. Dupree smiled wide. Bingo! His eyes glowed red. So, I'm going to stop there. There's a little bit more to that scene. Some of the better parts of that scene, I think, coming up. Better to read it than me to read it to you. And so I love that scene because it's reminiscent of some of my favorite scenes in movies, which inspire a lot of my writing. There are two scenes in particular that really connect with me. The first one is from when I was a teenager. I went and saw a movie with Al Pacino and Robert De Niro called Heat. And there's this one scene where Pacino's character, a cop, is sitting down with De Niro's character, the crook he's chasing, the bank robber he's chasing, and they have coffee in this diner. These two men have been, in this game of cat and mouse, and it's intense, and it's just this conversation of them talking, knowing that there is an inevitable confrontation coming, and that conversation is filled with intensity, and yet no one lifts a finger against the other. And I love that scene, and it's no mistake to me that I'm also very enamored of what I think is the greatest comic book hero scene of all time, with respect to the Captain America worthy moment in Endgame, but the Dark Knight with the Joker and Batman in the interrogation room. That right there is the intensity of that moment, where the Joker is essentially convincing Batman that he's not all that bad. That is a terrifying moment of cinema for me, is because the Joker says something that really connects and resonates with people, and that's scary. So as we go forward in this book, as you were to go on in Red Hand Rising, there's a lot of things that we set up. This book was probably my least favorite for the reasons that I've talked about, but also the very fact that it is essentially a book that establishes where the series goes from. And every book does that. Every book kind of like, oh, here's where we're going next. But Red Hand Rising was almost exclusively for that. I had to introduce characters like the Zeitgeist. I had to introduce Landon Conley. I had to establish or end the mystery or the question of who was Lucifer. And so all of that kind of stuff goes together. And what I really, really look forward to when the next time we get together and we talk about Bane of Nostalgia, Book 3, is that Book 2 doesn't pay off until you read Book 3. Like there is a real sense of that. And I think that Book 3, in many ways, it's the middle point of the series. There's a lot of payoff in Book 3. And so I'm looking forward to talking with you guys about that, which actually I'm going to bump up a little bit quicker. I'm going to talk about Bane of Nostalgia next week, because I will be releasing Book 4, Sawyer Shepherd Chronicles, Fall of Man, within the next 2 weeks. And so I wanted to go through this brief series here where I talked about like my rationale behind the writing of these books and some sort of behind the scenes stuff for the purpose of getting you hopefully pumped to get Fall of Man. If Red Hand Rising is the book that I am, or novel that I'm least like a fan of my own work, Fall of Man may be the one I'm the most proud of. There are some things that I pull off in Fall of Man that I love. And again, it's not the last book, it's the next to last book. So it is definitely, the punches are not being pulled anymore in Book 4. So with that being said, I'm very much looking forward to unveiling that to the world. Last second plug, if you have not started reading the Sawyer Shepherd Chronicles, please do. I love this series. Book 1 is definitely a little clunky in some parts because of my inexperience. Book 2 is definitely world building, so it's a little slower in action. Book 3, Book 4, things go on all cylinders as we get into Book 5, which I've started writing right now, and I am so excited to see this story come to a conclusion, to an end. I love this book. I love this series. I love these characters. And I know that if you give it a chance, you'll love it too. Fans of Supernatural, got a lot of stuff in there for you. Hey, Supernatural, Carry On Wayward Son, right there. Fans of Percy Jackson, some of the same humor, some of the same sort of like childhood destiny being, overcome and dealt with. A lot of that stuff is in there too. But all in all, I also think it's got a deeper message. And so, which is really starting to come together, as you can see in Book 3 and Book 4. So, if you haven't had a chance, check out Sawyer Shepherd Chronicles, Rites of Passage, Book 1, Red Hand Rising, Book 2, Bane of Nostalgia, Book 3, and coming very, 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 very soon, Book 4, Fall of Man. Thank you guys for joining us today on the Didactic Cafe. I've been your host, Chad Lehrmann.